The 1920s was also called the Roaring Twenties, and for a good reason. The American culture was experiencing dramatic changes in fashion trends, social and political aspects, and booming economic growth. The nation's wealth more than doubled in the years between 1920 and 1929. With this booming economic growth, many Americans were able to make the transition into a consumer society. Um, One of the most familiar symbols of the 1920s was probably the flapper. These were young women who attended speakeasies or illegal bars. They drank, they smoked, they danced, and they took risks. Um, they cut off their hair into a short bob style haircut and wore makeup. They also wore short skirts. This paradigm shift from the old Victorian image of womanhood into the flapper lifestyle gave women more freedom to express themselves socially and sexually. With, in addition to being more sexually free than previous generations, women's suffrage introduced women into the political sphere of American life. Um, when passed in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Though slow to use, their newly won voting right, by the end of the decade, women were represented on local, state, and national political committees. And they were influencing the political agenda of the federal government, even. Another cultural change for women in the 1920s was the advent of new technology like electrical home appliances. This made the burden of housework easier and less time consuming. As a result of these cultural changes, a woman of the 1920s would be remembered as the new woman. As mentioned before, a flapper in the 1920s might engage in drinking. However, one might be shocked to find out that the buying of alcohol was illegal in the 1920s due to prohibition, which began on January 16th, 1920, when the 18th Amendment was passed, or went into effect, banning the manufacture and sale of intoxicating beverages that contained over 0.5% alcohol. Even though the sale of alcohol was illegal, that didn't stop people from getting it. Alcoholic drinks were still widely available in underground bars, known as speakeasies. And this is where large amounts of alcohol would be smuggled in, even from other countries like Canada. Prohibition was meant to fix many problems in America that were linked to alcohol, but it had quite the opposite effect. Many of these speakeasies that people were going to were ran by racketeers, bootleggers, and organized crime members like Al Capone, who was said to have had over half of Chicago's police force on his payroll. In addition to corruption of the police, alcohol became more dangerous to consume, and prisons became more full. But, the manufacturing and selling of alcohol was just one of the freedoms that was restricted on in the 1920s, while many other freedoms expanded during that time, like the freedom to buy consumer goods, which was definitely booming. Many Americans had extra money and to spend, and spend it they did. Following World War I, the industrial companies of the United States transitioned from wartime production to peacetime production. This caused a huge boom in technological advances and consumer products. The most important consumer product of the 1920s had to have been the automobile, It was getting these people to all the, new places they were going to, the movies, work, just where they needed to go. In 1929, there was one car on the road for every 5 Americans. And this is when installment buying became popular, which was buying on credit. And this allowed families to purchase these larger consumer products and pay for them at a later time. Let me just end by saying that the 1920s were filled with cultural changes that influence and shape our culture today. The 20s were arguably the first modern decade, but many of the social and cultural revolutions would play themselves out over the future.